for this last section, I'd like to talk about some of the Old Testament prophecies. Now, this isn't a prophecy. Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac isn't a prophecy. It's a type. It's a story that became fulfilled by the person of Christ. We all know about the fact that Abraham was asked by God to go to the mountain of Moriah and there to offer his only son, his beloved son, as a burnt offering. So at the time, Isaac did not know why they were going there. So Abraham received this calling, and of course, he's obedient to God. It takes them 3 days to get there. And this event, which we call the sacrifice of Isaac, is called the binding of Isaac by the Jews. And it's a very important story for them. Now, to this day, the Jews debate why this story is even in the Bible. Why is this even in the Bible? Okay, it's just a louder. Does it make any difference? Oh, it's not on. It's not on. No, no.
All right. You can see how.
Okay. Anyhow, they don't understand to this day why that story is in the Bible. The idea of God asking somebody to sacrifice their child, even though he didn't go through with it, right? Abraham's hand was lifted up. He was about to plunge the dagger into Isaac, and he was stopped, as we know. But the very idea is so horrific. To this day, it's still discussed among the Jews. We know why that story is in the Bible. Christians do. Because it was a foreshadowing of what would happen later with Jesus. God did not spare his son for us. That kind of sacrifice was not asked of Abraham in the end, but it has deeper ramifications. So God prepared the world for what would happen at the cross. And some of the Jews will say the story is in the Bible because once upon a time, child sacrifice was offered to the God of Israel. Others would say, no, this story proves that God never wanted child sacrifice. It is none of that. It's all about the fact that this would come to represent something that would be fulfilled later by Jesus Christ. Because this isn't in the Bible, but in the Jewish writings, other Jewish extra-biblical writings, Abraham was told to take Isaac, his beloved son, and sacrifice him on the 12th day of Nisan. That's the month. They walked for 3 days. That means the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th. And he offered Isaac for sacrifice on the 14th of Nisan. Now, the Jews came to regard this story as very important because they realized that Isaac had to be a willing participant. It doesn't say that in the story. But Abraham was old, over 100 years old. Isaac was not a little child. Abraham could not have overpowered him. Isaac was a young man. So they realized that Isaac, in order to be bound, had to agree to become a sacrifice. So years later, when the Jews left Egypt, they left Egypt on that last night the night before Passover, when the angel of death passed over them, that was the day that Isaac was offered in sacrifice. And they believed that it was because of the merits of Isaac that they were saved from slavery in Egypt. So they believe that Isaac is a salvific figure. He's not only the son of Abraham, but the son of Abraham who would to produce all the Jewish people, because Abraham had another son, Ishmael, right? So because of Isaac, the Jewish people trace their ancestry back to Isaac. So his willingness to be sacrificed matches the willingness of Christ. So Isaac was offered, he was bound and offered on the 14th of Nisan, which is the eve of Passover, which is the same exact date that Jesus was crucified. That's not an accident. This was fulfillment. So when Abraham was stopped from plunging the dagger into Isaac, he looked up and he saw a ram, and it was caught by its horns in a thicket. And it was standing upright on its hind legs. And he took the ram and he offered the ram in sacrifice. Jesus was not a little lamb. He wasn't a baby. He was a full-grown sheep. He was a ram. That's the meaning of the ram that was offered. Not a little lamb, but a ram. So the church came to understand that Jesus was the fulfillment of this. But the Jewish people also understood that they benefited from the willingness of Isaac to be sacrificed. And they even talked about Isaac, who walked for 3 days with his father, carrying the wood on his back and for the sacrifice. And they said he carried the wood as one who carries his cross. There were many, many messianic prophecies in the Jewish scriptures. And the Jews could not understand the prophecies. Now, prophecies aren't easy to understand, but they were particularly confusing for the Jewish people because there were prophecies about a victorious Messiah, son of David. Then there were prophecies about a suffering Messiah. And they didn't understand how these things could possibly go together. How could you have a victorious king, son of David, and then also a suffering Messiah? This is not possible. Well, the church came to understand that. So let's talk about two of the prophecies that talk about the suffering of Christ, Messiah. One, of course, is Isaiah 53. And this is the one that says, "Who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He came before us as a young plant. He didn't have anything wonderful there was no beauty in him that we should admire him. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. We despised him. We esteemed him not. By his stripes we are all healed." Remember that? He was led like a lamb to the slaughter and opened not his mouth, etc. That whole chapter of Isaiah is so powerful that it is no longer read in the synagogue to the Jewish people, because whenever they hear it, they think of Jesus. So it's been removed from the Jewish lectionary. So what they have done is that they've decided it created so much discussion about how this cannot refer to Jesus. They decided to stop reading from it altogether. And by the way, Jews don't have Bible studies the way we do. We will have a Bible study. If you're going to do Isaiah, eventually you get to that chapter. Not them. They study the Talmud, which is the law. They don't study the Bible, so they don't really sit and read the Jewish scriptures and come to that by accident. So that's one of them. So clearly, it's the suffering servant of the Lord. Now, in the most common way that Jews explain this passage of the suffering servant and say it's not about Jesus is because in some places in the Old Testament, it calls Israel my servant in the singular. Israel represents all the Jewish people. Now, so they say this is not about Jesus. This is about the Jewish people who have suffered wrongfully over the generations. But Isaiah 53 is not about a group of people. It's about one person who suffered even though he was innocent. And by his suffering, others were saved. That's what it says. So even though they try to explain how it doesn't involve Jesus Christ, nonetheless, that passage is about one person and how his sufferings, even though he is blameless, save or heal the people. The Jewish people can't be their own Messiah, okay? And by the way, they haven't been innocent for their whole history, suffered innocently, okay? So it's not that. Another very famous passage is Psalm 22. Jesus says the first line from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This particular line is probably the most misunderstood statement of Christ. People will say, well, he felt despair from the cross. No, he is reciting the first line. That was the title. They didn't have numbers. They didn't say, everybody sing Psalm 22. Instead, they all said, everybody sing, my God, why have you forsaken me? Just like we don't say, everybody sing hymn 38. Instead, we'll say, let's all sing Soson Kyrie ton Lonzo or Ti per Maho or something like that. The first line is the title. Jesus was praying the psalm or calling it to the attention of the people there because it was prophetic. It talks about, it says, they have pierced my hands and my feet. People surround me. They wag their heads. They say, let God deliver him if he delights in him. They cast lots for my clothing, etc. So it's a prophetic psalm because it describes the scene. But about 2/3 of the way down the psalm, it changes. And it becomes a psalm of victory, of triumph. And it talks about how the person who's suffering, who's dying, will stand in the midst of the congregation and praise the Lord. It talks about how all the ends of the earth will remember the Lord, how all of the families of the earth will worship him, that people will tell about what the Lord has done, how he brought deliverance through this. So it ends on a high note. So it is as if the Lord is saying, this prophecy is being fulfilled. And if you recite the whole psalm, you will see that's going to end up okay. It's going to turn out okay. Now, so I mentioned there are two types of messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. A victorious warrior king, son of David. But the other one is called the Messiah, son of Joseph. So there are stories and messianic prophecies of a suffering Messiah. They call him Messiah, son of Joseph. It was a teaching of the Jews back before the time of Christ. It remains absolute teaching of the Jews that there will be two Messiahs. But they have come to believe that the son of Joseph will die in battle. That part was added later, after the time of Christ. But then he would be followed by a victorious son of David Messiah. So one of the prophecies about the Messiah, son of Joseph, that is fulfilled by Christ has to do with the piercing of his side. Now, why is he son of Joseph? Why Messiah, son of Joseph? Because Joseph, this is Joseph of the Old Testament, the one who was sold by his brothers for silver coins. So he matches, he's a type of Christ. And that's why in our Holy Week services, Joseph is a type of Christ. We mention, no other church does, no other church has Saturday of Lazarus, no other church talks about these other things, including has Joseph as a type of Christ. We have hymns about Joseph in early Holy Week. That's not an accident. That's the early church. The early church understood that both prophecies were fulfilled by Jesus, the suffering Messiah, son of Joseph, victorious Messiah, son of David, because Joseph did no wrong. He suffered innocently. He was falsely accused, you see, and yet he was victorious in the end, and he saved not only his family and all the Jewish people. Do you remember why? Because he became the right-hand man of Pharaoh, and he saved the people from famine. He saved all of the people of Egypt, and they came to love him. So there's a lot of parallels between Joseph and Christ. And this is why Jesus fulfilled that prophecy also. Now, what about the piercing? We don't think too much about it, but it's very important because we don't think too much about it because Jesus is dead, right? When the soldier pierces his, goes through his, Jesus is hanging like this, and you could see his ribs. Sticks a javelin up there, pierces Jesus' side. When John describes that, he places a lot of emphasis on it. He says this, and out of his side came blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. 1. His testimony is true. 2. He knows he tells the truth. 2. That you might believe. He emphasizes 3 times that what he's saying is true. Why? So, we think, well, okay, so Jesus was pierced. It's not a nice thing, but what's the big deal? Well, John then quotes 2 prophecies. The first one is, not a bone of his shall be broken. So Jesus died before the thieves, and the thieves were still alive. So they took a big iron mallet, they smashed the legs of the thieves so that they would die. And this caused loss of blood and loss of blood circulation. So without the blood circulating through the body, they just expired. Jesus' bones were not smashed. Why is that significant? Because the Passover lamb had to be eaten without breaking any bones. That's in the Torah. Okay, so that partly fulfills this identification of Jesus with the Passover lamb. Now, he also quotes this prophecy, they will look upon him whom they have pierced. Now that comes from the book of Zechariah. But I want you to listen to the whole prophecy and understand why that is important. By the way, this is a messianic prophecy to this day for the Jews. They don't deny this is messianic still. It's Zechariah. The person who's speaking is God. Zechariah wrote it down. The I is God. I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look upon me, whom they have pierced. Yes, they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. The one who is pierced is God. The prophecy there, not only in the Greek, but in Hebrew, it says, they will look upon me, upon him whom they have pierced. So the one who's speaking is God. That means that the Messiah, the suffering Messiah, is God himself. And this was something that John recognized. So Jesus is this suffering Messiah and the victorious Messiah together. When Pilate ascends the judgment seat and says, "Behold your king," it's about noon, about the sixth hour, John says. And then Jesus is taken to the cross and he dies at 3 p.m. Why does John tell us give us this time frame? At noon, people would come to the Temple Mount with their lambs. That's the hour that the gates of the Temple Mount would be open. People would begin to assemble. They came in 3 waves. There were thousands and thousands of people. And precisely at 3 p.m., they would begin sacrificing the lambs. Precisely at 3 p.m., Jesus died. Now, thousands of people brought their lambs to the temple, and it was so big the inner courts couldn't contain them. So they were in the outer court, and thousands of priests were involved. You would bring your lamb forward. There was a priest who would hang it, who would first slit the throat, hold it upside down, and they would catch the blood in a bowl. There was a line of priests stretching from the outer courts all the way through to the altar, and they would pass along the bowls of blood, hand them from one to the next, to the next, to the next. Hundreds of priests. The last priest would fling the blood in the altar, then they would bring it back to the front of the line, and thousands of lambs were slaughtered. The blood was collected, flung on the altar, and then the lambs were stretched out, hung from a hook, and quickly skinned. They were not burnt on the altar. Instead, these lambs were skinned, and then they were put back inside the skin of the lamb, taken home to be roasted. When they were roasted, they had to be roasted in a specific manner, in what was called a Passover oven. It was tall. They didn't roast them lengthwise like we do, like the Greeks do. In an oven, it was tall, not wide, because the lamb had to be roasted standing up. And it stood up with a wooden skewer. It had to be wood, could not be metal, through its anus all the way up to its neck, and another wooden skewer across its back through the shoulder blades. And as it stood in the oven, it looked like this. And it was all bloody because the skin had been removed, and it had its head and everything. It looked like a crucified man. So that's how the Passover lambs were roasted. So it didn't take too much, we could say, imagination for people to connect what happened to Christ and recognize that he was the fulfillment of all of these things. So he brought Passover fulfillment, but in a different way, and of course a much greater way than what they even anticipated, because the Jews were remembering their liberation from slavery in Egypt, led by Moses, and they were remembering, by the way, Isaac. But what Jesus brought was liberation from the slavery of sin and death. And this is why he is our model during Holy Week, and this is why we remember all these things during Holy Week. All of these things are echoed in the prayers and in the hymns of Holy Week. So with the last, 20 minutes or so, I thought I'd open it up to you for questions. How long did it take me to write? I have been talking about this for about, more than 40 years, 45 years, since before I was married, So I knew a lot of this. I didn't have to. It's a lot of the little details. The book took me a couple of years, but I didn't start from nothing. I didn't start from scratch. I knew a lot of this stuff, and I've been talking about it for a long time. But it was interesting. I did learn a lot. As much as you know something, when you begin to really research it, you find out a lot of other things. I was really happy I was able to do this because I answered a lot of my own questions, that I had. Anybody else? The question is, did they know where he was born? Did they know where he was born? Would it have made any difference, etc.? I don't think it would have made any difference. We can't know whether or not they knew that. The fact is, people usually grew up in the place where they were born. It was unusual for somebody to be born one place. As a matter of fact, after Jesus was born in the Gospel of Matthew, it tells us that Joseph was going to go back. After they left Egypt, he was going to go back to Bethlehem. But because Archelaus was ruling there, he was afraid to go because Archelaus was worse than his father, Herod the Great, very unstable, very murderous. So this is why they went back to Nazareth, which I guess where Mary was from. So I think they would have presumed that he wasn't from there. But even if they knew, I think they wouldn't have cared. Because Jesus was just, I think this is one reason why we have to be very careful about prophecy, like the book of Revelation. People take the book of Revelation and they say, okay, this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. We don't know. Prophecy is very inexact. It sketches something out, but exactly how it will be fulfilled, we don't know. Afterwards, we can see it and say, oh, of course. But while he's standing in front of them, if you realize that they would have expected the Messiah to be like them, not to be somebody who challenges them, who shows disrespect to them, I don't know that it would have made it any difference. I don't know. I wish I do. Anybody else? There are still Pharisees. Oh, there's still injustice and things like that. Oh, sure. Of course. That's why I think the story is important. It's important for us to remember and to place ourselves with those people and not assume, oh, I wouldn't have, voted to kill Jesus. I think, especially those of us who come to church, we have an idea of how things should be, and somebody comes along and does things that are very opposite what we might expect. It's very easy to fall into that trap of thinking we know better and falling into hypocrisy and pride and self-righteousness. Absolutely. As Orthodox Christians, we're especially vulnerable to that, I think, because we have in our minds of what you're supposed to do for Lent, for example. And so we can easily fall into self-righteousness and judgment of others. So you're absolutely right about that. That's true. Anyone else? You can just make comments if you want. And go ahead. Nothing? Don't be shy. Oh, go ahead. What do we do here in Orthodoxy, where we have a lot of traditions and rules, and we think of them as rules? First of all, we have to remember that what we're supposed to do as Orthodox Christians is acquire virtue, not follow rules and laws. There's no virtue in following rules for their own sake. We're supposed to use the guidelines that we have to become better people. We don't gain anything just by doing something because that's the tradition. That's what we're supposed to do. That breeds self-righteousness. As women, there is nothing we cannot do except be a priest and a bishop. There's nothing to hold us back from doing anything else, as a matter of fact. So for us to sit and say, well, we're not allowed to do these things. Now, in some Orthodox jurisdictions, particularly among the Russians, they tend to be much more restrictive. They don't want women to read the epistle or be a chanter or something like this. I think they're okay with the chanting. But mostly, we have to recognize that that's up to us. There's really no restriction in the church for involvement in the church, whether it's lay leadership, theology, chanting. The only thing you can't physically, and even doing church services, only sacraments or divine liturgy, that we can't do. We can do everything else. So we can't say, well, I'm a woman, because there are men who want to put us down. There's no doubt about that. And say, oh, women, they're not supposed to teach, they're not supposed to do this. And that's a sin. That's a sin. So we have to be the ones to stand up and say, because Christ had female disciples too. He didn't choose a woman to be among the 12, but he had women disciples, and they taught, and they even baptized. We don't do that today. But they taught, and they preached, and they did all kinds of other things. They were traveling with the Lord. So I think we should become a little bit more, not to be assertive or anything like this, but if you have a talent in an area, you should explore it, develop it, and use it for the church. You see what I mean? We don't come up here to say, well, I'm a woman, and therefore I'm going to chant, or I'm going to preach, or I'm going to teach, or whatever. No, you make yourself qualified so no one can say anything that you're not qualified. But if you're qualified, there's no reason why you can't do all of those things. I don't know if that doesn't ring true for you. If you do want is it harder for you as a woman? Sometimes. But it's really not a no. And I'm not denying the fact that if I was wearing a cassock, there wouldn't be a question. So definitely, when it comes to something like teaching or preaching, if a man is wearing a cassock, he's accepted without question. We have to make sure we meet a higher standard. We have to make sure that no one, first of all, a spiritual standard, a moral standard, a theological standard. We have to be above reproach, and we have to know what we're talking about. So there is an expectation. I think it's not as bad as it used to be, but still there will be those who say, well, I'm not so sure because she's a woman. And that's happened to me. But it doesn't mean no, you can't. It just means you should be prepared and offer what you have for the church. If they don't accept it, they don't accept it. That doesn't mean you stop writing or preaching or teaching or anything else. Yes. Well, the question was, or the statement was, so we have some rules, or we've had some canons in the church, and that women were in the past deacons. Yes, they were. They didn't have the liturgical role that a deacon has now, where he comes out and he says petitions. Women deacons had a special ministry to women and children. They would take communion to women who were sick, help with children, and take communion to children who were sick, this kind of thing. Now, we also have to remember that whatever roles are still allowed to us, and almost everything is, because you have to remember, a woman is just a lay person. Almost everybody in this congregation is a lay person. Only father, you have two priests, you still have two priests, or just one priest? Two priests. Only the priests are not. Do you have any deacons? We're currently doing okay. You have three people in this whole congregation who are clergy. Everybody else is at the same level. Okay? That's a fact. Women are at no different level than any other lay man. So if you have a talent to chant, learn how to chant. Study Byzantine music. Learn how to chant. If you have a talent for translation, learn how to translate. use that for the benefit of the church. Whatever it is, for teaching, whatever it is. The early church had women leaders in leadership positions of all kinds. The only thing they couldn't do would be a bishop or a priest. And so most of the work that's done in the parish is not done by the bishops and the priests. So it's really up to us to say that I want to be involved and use my talents for the benefit of the church, whatever it might be. So we don't see the priesthood as a position of power. This is the difference between us and the Catholic Church, where you have the clergy, the priests and the bishops. It's very male-dominated. The power is up there with them. And people below, especially women, feel like they don't have a voice. But the women pretty much run our parishes, you know? We have a lot of say. And we also have a lot of influence over what happens. The lay people in general have a strong degree of influence. You have parish assemblies. You have metropolis assembly. We have the archdiocese assembly. We vote on everything together. The priest doesn't tell everybody what to do here. The bishop doesn't make orders and everybody jumps. So we have a lot of say, but we have to be willing to do the work and participate. It's harder for us. It's harder for some men. There are men who don't want to see women involved. Let's just face it. That's true. But that's because, and if there are canons that really don't talk too much about women, they don't really forbid women, the reason is, until recently, women didn't have this option unless they were a nun. Why is that? Because a woman didn't have the opportunity for an education. I mean, this is the 21st century. My mother, it was a big deal that she graduated from high school. She got a portrait holding her diploma. That was a big deal in the Great Depression. Her father wanted her to drop out of school, go to work. My father dropped out of school. You think nobody bothered to educate women. What, they're just going to go off and get married and have babies. Women didn't have the opportunities because there were no disposable diapers. Can you imagine? No prepared foods. You had to raise. I mean, do you remember? I remember ironing the sheets. We didn't have percale sheets. How many of you remember ironing sheets? Yes. That's a lot of work. A lot of work. Women stayed home. Almost no women, and when I was growing up, worked. Because there was so much work in the home. So we simply didn't have the opportunities. Now that we do, we're going to make our mark in the church. But don't let anybody tell you you don't have a place. Okay? Anybody else? You thank me for saying, I tried to write it so that you felt like you were there. And I succeeded. I really appreciate that, because I said, how am I going to make this a page turner and everybody knows what the outcome is going to be? I didn't know if it was possible. So I'm glad it had that effect, because look, we all love the Lord. We come to church every Holy Week. We hear those stories over and over and over. Sometimes they're so familiar that they don't really move us anymore, or we don't know enough. We think we know everything, but it's just a bare outline of what happened. We don't really understand what happened. So thank you for that. Anybody else? Yes, in the back. About the Theotokos? Actually, that's been on my to-do list for a long time. I don't know. I have so many things that need to be. I want to write a sequel to this book on the resurrection. And I want to write one on Revelation. I think that's badly needed too. So, if God gives me the years and the health, I will do all of that. I was a little bit nervous about writing about her. I've been a little bit nervous about but I think it's important. It would be, I think, along the lines of what I talked about when I came here years ago. I think there's a way to talk about her that's different than what we usually think of. She deserves that too, a fresh approach. Yeah, yeah. Anyone else? Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you again.